Good evening, everyone. So, you tell someone that you're in Kolel and you're learning Hilchos Amira L'Nachri. What's the first thing people think you're learning? Probably go out of your house into the streets. There's something wrong with the lights in your house, and you go out on an adventure to see who looks the least threatening or the most friendly. And once you hit in on your target, then you go over to them, and then you have to engage in this dance where you say, but you don't say, you hint, but you don't quite spell out what you want, and then they have to figure it out, and they have to be nice enough to walk into a stranger's house and flip your switch or whatever the problem is. Right? So, however, hasn't quite been the focus here in the Hilchos Amira L'Nachri, right? We've been focusing more on the business aspect. Shuchat spoke about Shtar Het Mechira on Shabbos. I also spoke about running websites on Shabbos, etc. And of course, much of the Simanim Shulchan Aruch we're learning about right now also are dealing with these types of questions in the terms of what life was like back then. But we can't ignore the main question for too long. And l'chayra, people would say it's probably the most common. So we have to talk about and address this issue a little bit. I'm not announcing that we're changing focus right now to focus on this. If there's a demand, if people want to, we can discuss it. I would like to characterize this as a shtickle hagdama. This is not this is a sugya you have to go through for weeks, if not longer. This is sort of an introductory shiur to introduce you to the general topic, the general issues involved. And in particular, there's a discussion in the last couple of years as to whether Chabad, the way we pasken halacha, l'fi the Alter Rebbe, whether we have a different shita than the rest of the world, or whether the whole world is doing something wrong according to the Alter Rebbe. So that's something that's something I would like to introduce. And so, of course, it's just a beginning. It's just a prompt for much further discussion and learning. Now, part of the problem with this topic is that it's not really a major discussion in the earlier Makaitis, even as late as the Alter Rebbe. That's not the central discussion, the central focus. So it was really left to the Svarim in the last 50, 70 years to really make a seder and to explain what the yesodis of this concept are. And then it's possible to discuss and be ma'ayin. So to present how these halachas are widely understood today, so it's going to be based on a sefer by the name of Pia Pascha B'Chachma. Bought a copy for the Kolel. I showed it to some of you. The author is Pesach Elio Falk. He just passed away not too long ago in Tafshin Pei. He was a mechanech and a paisik in England, in Gateshead. He's most famous. You go to the Oil Meshavelt. He's most famous for his work, Oiz V'Hadar Levusha, where he sort of laid out in painstaking detail every single prat of tznius, Menegaya women and their dress, and that's considered the Bible of tznius, the code of dress for women in the yeshiva Sha'elam Meshavelt. It's been translated into many languages, Hebrew, English, many others, tens of thousands of copies. So that sefer is Oiz V'Hadar Levusha. The next pasuk is Pia Pascha B'Chachma. Volume 1 was about opening bottles on Shabbos. That's why they picked that name, I guess. But Chelik Beis moves on to other inyanim, and it's in part about Amira L'Nachri. So he didn't write it mamish himself. The way they presented it is he has two talmidim that were going through the sugya with him, and as they were going through it, they wrote it up. And he was Magiyat, he went over it, and he passed away in the middle of being Magiyat for the second print. So I think this sefer happens to be a very good one. There's something very yesodistic about how he goes to an issue, presents it, and builds it up. In Bechlal, you have two categories. You have Poiskim, and you have Malaktim, and usually that Venn diagram, they don't overlap. It's not exactly the same category. A Poisik is not a Malakit, a Malakit is not a Poisik. But here, he's talking more in the gather of Pesach. They quote in the beginning of the Sefer that Rabbi wrote in his Askama many years ago that I'm asking that he's a Gadol B'Torah and that he should be mischasha b'dvarav k'chacham shahayra, which they say is unusual for a Moshe to write. I'm not here to overstate his praises, but I'm explaining why I'm using his work as the basis for the following. So in chapter 10, Gidrei Isser Amira, he starts off by being magda that there's two kinds of ramazim. Assuming that you're not actually just telling the non-Jew what to do, there's two categories of ramazim. One is remes b'derech tzivui, it's a hint, but it's a command. And then there's remes b'derech sipur. It's a story-like hint, allusion. You're not saying, you're not actually telling them to do anything. These are the semi-official names for these gedarim that were accepted in the halachas forum in the last few decades. I didn't have a chance to see what the exact development, how these terms came to be. I would assume Shmir Shabbos Kol Chasa is probably one of the most influential svarim in Shabbos B'chlal and modern day halachas svarim B'chlal, so it probably has a lot to do with that. So what are these two gedarim? So he's masber remez derech tzivui. You can see an example of this, the mark of this idea in Shulchan Aruch Siman Shin Zayin. So it's in the Ramah in the last Sef and Sifcha Beis. And the first marker for this concept is from the Ur Zarua. But we'll quote from the Alter Rebbe, where the Alter Rebbe says it there in Sif Zayin. Kol davar she'asr loymer lenachri la'asayse b'Shabbos. If you're not allowed to tell him to do it, asr afilu lirma izlei la'asayse. You can't hint to it either. Hu adin she'asr loymer lo'yezet tzivui la'asayse davar hamutar. You can't even tell him something where what you said is technically mutar. But he understands it's implied that what he should really do is a malacha. What's the example? The example given is tell the non-Jew, wipe your nose. And he understands that's not kipshutai, but it's a euphemism that he should remove the coal on top of the candle that's disturbing the candle from burning. So technically all I said was wipe your nose. He understood that I'm really telling him to fix the candle. You essentially did tell him to do exactly what you wanted him to do when he did, but you just didn't say it in quite those words. So that's not okay. That's Remes B'derech Tzivui. Later on, Sif Lamed Gimel, it says if there's a flood, something like that, you're allowed to call a non-Jew, even though by calling him to the scene, he's going to immediately get to work and try to help and save what he can. But this is a special din for Hefsed Gadol, not for regular cases. But you have to be careful not to say Shum Remes Tzivui L'Take, and even here you can't say Remes Tzivui. You are allowed to say Kol Hamatzel Hefsed Zeh Einei Mafsid Schar Tirchei. Whoever saves this, you won't lose out. Which is, the makar is already in Chazal regarding a fire. So what we're saying here is that it's not just a fire, it's kol hafsid. Then the Alter Rebbe says, yesh oimrim, that it's only by a dleika. You can say this lashon, kol hamatzel eini mafsid. But if you're mekel kusvara harishoyin and a hafsid meruma, also lay hafsid. So no one loses all around. So even though there's a bit of a distinction here between Remes Tzivui, but mutter loymar, according to this opinion, kol hamatzel, but even kol hamatzel is also kind of in this category of Remes B'derech Tzivui. It's a specific type of Remes B'derech Tzivui, which might be okay in certain cases. At any rate, this is all limited to Hefsed Gadol. So we see that if it's not Hefsed Gadol, you can't do Remes B'derech Tzivui. Even, certainly, Kol HaMatzel, Hefsed Zeh Eini Mafsid. So Falk adds in his Sefer that in the Poskim, more recent Svarim, we find different Lashonis that are considered to be in this category of Remes B'derech Tzivui. And what they all have in common is that in each case, you're essentially saying, in one way or another, what you want him to do. There's a certain action, and you're communicating that that's what you want him to do. So why is it only a Remes and not a Tzivui? Because there's something missing from you, something lacking in your sentence. Either the part where you tell him to do it is omitted. Let's say you're maybe standing and pointing at the light. So technically you didn't say anything, but it was pretty clear that you're asking him to do a specific thing. Or the spelling out what you want him to do, meaning, can you please illuminate this room? Okay, so technically I didn't say, can you please flip the switch? I said, can you please illuminate this room? But I told him to do something, so that is also a Remes B'derech Tzivui. right? Because ultimately, in other words, ultimately, when he does what he's doing, it's not that he made a decision on his own. When he was doing it, he felt, this person asked me essentially to do something, and now I'm going to do what he asked me. Yeah, okay, he didn't technically ask me in those words, but I understand that he's asking me, and that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to fulfill his request. So that's Remez B'derech Tzivui. Then there's Remez B'derech Sipur, the second category. So we'll use the way the Alter Rebbe presents it there in the Hemshech of Sif Zayin. The Makar is from the Magen Avram, whose Makar is from Maram Mintz, where this idea comes from. If he doesn't tell him any order, but he just says something from which he derives on his own that he should do a malacha, then it's okay. What's the example? He's the delivery man, the mailman, he brought a sealed envelope. Shabbos, he's not allowed to open it. So Yochel Lemer Lahanachri, Eini Yochel Lekreisa Kolzman She'eina Psucha. It gives you the quote that he could tell. He can say to the non-Jew, I can't read it as long as it's not open. And then he opens it on his own. There was no statement here of a specific thing to do. All he said was, can't read it. Too bad. It's his own conclusion, his own understanding, his own decision to do it. The shaila is, what is the exact Hagdara here? Right? He's still doing something on behalf of a Yid, and we'll get back to the Alter Rebbe here. There's a line here the Alter Rebbe adds, we'll get back to it later on. As we go further, we see the Mishnah Brura. Taka develops this idea further. You look at Mishnah Brura and Sifkat Nayin Vav. Asr Lirmoy, the Ramah said, not to be Meramis, Derech Tzivui, because that's what the Mishnah Brura says, that's included in Amira. And you're also not allowed to, then he brings this vart that you can't tell him to wipe his nose, this in this style. But if it's taken not b'loshen tzivui, you can go in she'omer haner. Now he gives other examples now. Haner einei meir yafe. The candle isn't burning well. It's too bad I can't read to the light of this candle because there's a coal in it. There's something at the top. It's disturbing the light. The non-Jew hears it and fixes it. Shari, it's okay. It's not included in speech. There's no Amira here, but isn't there another problem? Isn't there a problem of Hana from Malacha? Right? We know even if there's no Amira whatsoever, if he goes on his own volition, his own initiative, and he goes out and does something generally, you're still not allowed to have Hana from that Malacha. So he says, in this case, we're talking about cases, the Einza Hana Kol Kach, the Gam Koidim Hayochel Al Piat Chak Likreis La'eder. We're talking about a case where he was able to read until now, it just was difficult. So we're going to get into these categories in a moment. But we see already the Mishnah Brura is widening. The original Marament was Igeres. Magen Avram, Alter Rebbe kept on just repeating Igeres, which is a very specific case. That guy's a mailman, as we'll see. But the Mishnah Brura, we're getting to that. That's a separate. We're going to get to that as well. That has something to do with the Remez. When it's Tzerech Rabbim, so we're getting to that. Okay, so the Mishnah Brura is already expanding this to include other common scenarios. So this is how we're watching it. We're watching this turn into a more general concept in Hilchos Shabbos now. So in that sefer, Rabbi Falk says, Remez b'derech sipur or shaloi b'derech tzivui is where there's no instruction at all. You're just describing, you're telling them a story about your situation, and it's understood that you will have benefit if such and such will be done. And the examples he gives is, I can't sleep as long as the light is on, or it's too bad that the light's on for no reason. That would not be considered a Amir Lanachi, it would be fine. He adds there in the Ha'ara, you should know, in his opinion, that even if in your story that you're telling, you even mention the Malacha clearly, meaning you say, I am a Yid, and I'm not allowed to turn on the light. So technically, you actually mention turn off the light. So technically, you mention the words, turn off the light. You mentioned it in the context of I'm a Yid, and I'm not allowed to turn off the light. Otherwise, when you spoke to them directly, you just said, "Oh, I wish the light was off. If only the light was off. I'm a yid. I'm out to turn off the light." That would still be okay, according to Falk. He says you could even say that, if it was a weekday, if it was Sunday, you know what I would do right now? I would probably go and flip that switch right now. Oh, but I can't. It's Shabbos. So very explicit, but technically you never mentioned that action in the context of doing something in here and now. So he says, the Shevet HaLevi, in fact, disagrees. Look up the Shevet HaLevi. The Shevet HaLevi is in Shabbos Tshuvas Chelik Vav Siman Kuf Lamed Gimel at Tshuva to Rav Yaakov Yitzchak Naiman, Bells in Montreal. So the shaila is that people park their car on the side of the road, and all of a sudden, I guess in Montreal where there's heavy snow, it can happen that when they want to clear the snow away, and they say they're a bit better at it than we are over here. They don't want the snow to just pile up on top of the cars. They say you have to move all your cars right away so we can properly clear the street of all the snow. And there are people that didn't pay attention, and now they're going to get a ticket. So can you have a non-Jew move the car? So Shevet HaLevi says it's difficult to find a heter. You're going to tell me Amira Derech Remiza from Siman Shin Zayin Sifcha Beis. What are you going to tell him? You're going to tell him, I can't drive the car, and he's going to drive it on his own, which is what Rav Naiman had suggested. He says, this is an Isser Gomer. He says, the Magen Avraham and the Paiskim, they say, if you say, I can't read, and he does it on his own. So all you said, the words that came out of your mouth, referred to things that are mutter on Shabbos. You're allowed to read letters on Shabbos? You're allowed to read letters on Shabbos. And now you said, Oi, I can't read this letter on Shabbos. So your sentence only included Shabbos-tika things in it. That's how he understands it. But if the remez refers directly to the Isser, so if you say, I can't light it, I can't travel, Shevet HaLevi says, immediately that means it's already Asr. And he says, I already learned from experience that it's very difficult to be made a heter unless it's a Tzedach Gadol, which is not usually the category for this. It's not supposed to be a Tzedach Gadol. It should be in any situation. But I'm only made a heter in a Tzedach Gadol because B'nai Adam Pshutayam, they don't get it. So hard to master the rules of how to say it properly that they're going to get it wrong. And now you're telling me that this happens all the time. Snow falls, they want to clear the road. This is not a one-time thing. This is an oft recurrence. So there's also Bizayin Mezuzal of Shabbos. So I find it difficult to be matir, the Shevet HaLevi said, but I'm not closing the door and that I'm in and you're in and I'm out. You be matir and aser according to how you understand. You respect Rav Naiman enough so Rav Naiman can come to his own psak. So the Shevet HaLevi seems to disagree. You can't mention anything directly about the Isser, even in a story-like way. But the Falk Tainas, that Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and the Rabbi Yashiv paskend Farkart. L'chayra, adding on our own, seemingly there's a lot of room for thought here, a lot of room to question what these G'darim are. We're basically coming up with these G'darim on our own in the last 10, 20 years. So it's definitely open to debate.
Who do you say said that?
He said, Rav Falk said.
Oh, it's his own shit.
Yeah. Mr. Brewer just said, Haner Eine Meir Yafa, or Eine Yochel Likris L'er Haner. Falk said, you can say, if it was Sunday, I would...
But with that's already a double also that he's saying, you're right.
He doesn't mention the Isser. That's what the Shevet HaLevi will tell you.
No, that's all right.
L'chayra, everything he's saying is highly debatable. You don't have to take his word for it. And I'm curious to hear what your opinion is, not all at once. Especially the case of during the week, I would turn the light off like that. Does that sound like that? More like Derech Tzivui or more like Derech Sipur? A little hard to.
How do we eliminate the shlichus element also? I mean, there's the other side of it.
The idea is he's he's completely working on his own.
But isn't he doing it at the end of the day? Like, do I need to convince him to sit in the house with me?
So he does not mention that at all. I was going to touch on that at the end. So would seem that, B'chal, even though I'm quoting him, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the final word. Even if you generally hold by these ideas, if you hold of it as derech sipur, it doesn't mean you have to be maskim on every prat. But I'm just presenting what he said. He adds another point. He says, even if you turn to the non-Jew directly, and it's very obvious that you walk down into the street, you stop the person in the middle of the street, and you start telling him a story. Oh, if only my light was off. What does the context suggest? What aren't you implying, please do something? He says, no, it's still not a mir lanachri, because you didn't say any hera or tzivoi. Even beremes, you just, you shared your plight, and that would not be isra mir lanachri. And he says, how do I know this? Because of all the poskim that have been writing for the last many years, that you can tell eremes with derech sipur. If you hold that that's not allowed, then in what case would you be able to? It would eliminate almost all the cases, because most of the time you're going outside to find someone. If going outside automatically means that it's pretty strongly implied that it's a tzivui, then it would only work, like the case of Shulchan Aruch, where the person delivered something to your house, and then you ask, by the way, this and that. To him, that seems like absurd, because everyone's been talking about this, and most people have not mentioned that its mamash very limited. It does say that here it's the opposite. Yashiv is quoted as saying that it is a problem. The second you turn directly outside to someone, it's already derech tzivui. But he says the Shevet HaLevi is quoted as saying that it's that many other poskim that it's fine. He writes, "B'chein no galmo mikadmas dino lahakabuz." This is what everyone does. You go outside. You're not cheshish that going outside is a problem. So that's that discussion. The next question, as we mentioned, is like the Mishnah Berurah mentions, what about the hana? Let's say there's no amira, but aren't you having hana from the malacha? And isn't that the case even if he completely volunteers, even if you were completely unaware, not involved? So he says there are a number of exceptions, and three of them are what he calls pe'ula siluk. You're removing something, so there's no hana chiyuvis. You're not enjoying something. You didn't accomplish something new. You're just preventing something. And he explains that the reason why this is not asur is because chachamim only asur hana. That's a direct result of the malacha. But here, the hana is not a result of the malacha. The malacha got rid of something that was going to disturb your hana. Right? The fire broke out. He eliminated the fire, so you can keep enjoying your possessions. He didn't create new possessions for you.
What if the light's off? You can't tell everybody, turn the light on.
Well, let's go one thing at a time. He adds not only if it's a future problem, where the problem is actually going to come in a while, it could even be something that's bothering you already. So, for example, let's say the light is on in a room and you want it to be turned off in order to sleep there. So even though you already couldn't sleep there, the problem is already here. The problem already arrived. You couldn't sleep there. And now the chayre bring mechadash anu hana. Now I could sleep here. But he says, no, the Svarin they send us that it's still the Gedr Siluk, because the sleeping is still not a direct result of lack of a light, so we can't say that sleeping is a direct outcome of kibui. The kibui still just eliminated the problem that was preventing you from sleeping, and now you can sleep. He says, this is what Peskim Taka say. That's Pu'ula Siluk. Another category is Manias Kilkum. Manias Kilkum means that you didn't actually do any pu'ula. There is no new pu'ula in the world that was created with created here. The malacha is just preserving the status quo. What would be the example of that? The food is already hot, and he does hatmana. So technically, nothing new happened here. The thing was hot before; it's still hot now. All he did was preserve the heat that was already there. Right? As opposed to extinguishing fire with water. Here, you took a fire and now there's no more fire. At least you actually accomplished something. This is even less than that in a sense. And he says the reason is because he quotes the Alter Rebbe, the Lashon of the Alter Rebbe in Simulation in Zion. There's no new hana here. It just is preserving what we had before. And he clarifies this only would apply to food, where we say that this is hot food. But a room would not have the same gather. A hot room there's the room and there's the heat. They're considered two separate things. So if you add wood, have the guy add wood to the fire, that would be considered a hana chadasha. So you always have to know exactly how these things apply. The third category he mentions is tesefas hana. that you already have the hana a little bit. And now we're just increasing the hana that you already had. Like the example the Mishnah Berurah mentioned, that you already had some light, and now we're just increasing, we're getting more light. And in Hara, he comments and he says, you really have to be bisbainin in every single case to be magdir. Is this Gemura? Is it Tesefes? Is it a new thing? Is it just an extension? And he says, even if it's a Tesefes, but the outcome of the Tesefes is that it changes the nature of the thing, then it's considered a new hana. What would be an example of that? It says in Shulchan Aruch, if the food was already and then you did something and you were meisif in the bishul, you're not allowed to eat it. Is not just tesefes hana. It was already edible, and now it's more edible. So that's already a different. It's a different category of echos. It's a different. You can say that this was a half edible of a piece of food, and now this is a fully edible piece of food. So that wasn't. That's a chiddush in hana. So those are the three major categories in which, if malacha is done, whether we weren't supposed to do the malacha, or maybe the guy did it, so there wasn't a problem of amira. Now the question is, can you have ana? If it's in these types of scenarios, then it's not a problem to be nana from that malacha. There are other gdarim in addition, but that's enough to give you a picture of what we're talking about. And by the way, as you mentioned, there are cases where you're allowed to tell the non-Jew directly to do something. And now those are cases of shvus to shvus, right? Shvus to shvus is Amir Lanachi is one shvus, and then you're telling him to do it d'Rabbanan, that's another shvus. So that, as he explains in the next chapter, chapter 13, there's 4 gdarim for that. When you're allowed to do that, tzarech mitzvah, hafsid gadol, tzarech gadol, and tzar haguf, as he explains. We're not getting into that now. And he mentions, by the way, that all electricity is considered d'Rabbanan for this purpose. Huh? Tzar haguf would be no. Well, it's considered equivalent to miktas chayli. Tzar haguf is like miktas chayli. An example that would not fit into many of the examples that you have, or it's not quite, doesn't quite reach any of those levels. Let's say one of the main lights in your house is off. It's not tzarech mitzvah because you can do whatever you wanted to do before. Not hafsid gadol, it's not a tzarech gadol, it's not tzar haguf. It's just annoying. Many other cases like that.
And this is tzar haguf. The person can't sleep at night when the light is on in his room.
Right, so it might be in the category of tzar haguf, in which case everything we said before about Remez Sipur for turning off the lights. The question is if lights is considered d'Rabbanan or not. That would be the problem. That would be the question. Therefore, you might have to use the Remez Sipur approach instead of shvus to shvus if it's not a shvus. So Gabi electricity says generally electricity is considered d'Rabbanan except for light bulbs. Light bulbs would be considered d'Oraisa, and in that gufa, except for LED lights, which are becoming increasingly common, LED lights would be considered d'Rabbanan.
He says only LED is exception.
Yeah.
He
says Isser includes fluorescent. Fluorescent, even though others it's known say otherwise. Fluorescent is included in their LEDs are d'Rabbanan.
In a situation that technically using the light to go out, you get to tell the guy to do the Shina, or you can tell the guy to just the full categories of those. No.
There are other concepts where if it's psikresha for the guy, it could be a much bigger kula. If it's malachashin tzirich legufa for the guy, we're not getting into.
What's the situation you tell the guy to do?
No, shvus to shvus, you can tell him, go ahead and do this.
And if there's a situation you are told to do it only in the way of the Shina or not?
Didn't come across that when going through this material.
How do we define if the light is d'Oraisa with Rabbanan?
He said all light bulbs except LED. That's what he said.
The reason
Why? Okay, we're not getting into that.
The reason I'm asking that is because the dining room's light was off.
Mm-hmm.
We asked Rabbi Hoffman,
Mm-hmm.
the city, and he told us to call a guy,
Mm-hmm.
and he should do with the Shina, and should give him a wine.
Okay. So that's a different discussion. We have to get into that separately.
Most machines have lighting. A lot of machines have.
Right. Okay. So you have to keep possible, but that could be malachashin tzirich legufa. Malachashin tzirich legufa for a guy, or psikresha. Those we just said, those are things that's not an issue for a guy. So that's clearly not what he's trying to. It just has little lights blinking. That's
So
not.
the point you're making now is these 4 categories doesn't have to be there. Tzipur can be there.
Yeah, in those cases, your mom is telling him exactly what you want him to do, and it's no problem. But we're focusing. Yeah. But our main focus here is on the cases which don't fit into that, then you do have to be merames b'derech sipur. So then, in the next chapter, chapter 14, Barichas is Amir Lenochri Hadracha Lamaisa. So he sums up everything Lamaisa, so right? So you have Shvus to Shvus for certain cases, and you have Remes b'derech sipur, and that is Heter Gomor. You don't have to feel guilty about it, and that could be without a tzerach gadol. That's the whole point. And it could even be a malacha deiraisa. That's part of the point. And again, he emphasizes you're allowed to say, you're even allowed, according to him, you're even allowed to say that I'm not allowed to turn on the light, or I would have turned on the light if it was the weekday. And you have to be careful though. If he responds and says, "Oh, so you mean you want me to turn on the light?" You're not allowed to confirm. You can't even nod your head. You just have to keep on repeating yourself, or say, "If you'd like," whatever you want. Be careful. So there's a lot of pratim here of how to make sure you're doing it right and not being nichshel. Of course, you still have to keep in mind that this is only, unlike Shvus to Shvus. In that sense, Shvus to Shvus could be in every malacha, every situation. But in this case, again, the outcome of the malacha also has to be mutter, because it's either pu'ula siluk, turning off the lights, tesefes hana, there's already some light. And he gives a list of common examples of pu'ula siluk, turning off an alarm that's bothering you, turning off the gas, turning off the air conditioner, turning off a heater, turning off the lights, turning off electronic appliances, and turning off the car engine. Those would all be considered pu'ula siluk, and therefore you can do the Remes b'derech sipur and not do Amira, and he can do it, and you're having hana from the pu'ula siluk. Then he adds, as a problem b'chlal, that it's a situation where the second you walk through the door, it's going to be obvious what the problem is, and you call him in from the street without explaining yet what it is. So you told him a tzivui. Your tzivui was, come into my house. Then when he came into your house, he immediately understood what he had to do. That would count as Remes b'derech tzivui. So in that case, you have to be careful, either not to tell him clearly to come into your house, to tell him the whole Remes b'derech sipur in advance, something like that. So also another point to be careful about. He also gets to touches on the question as to whether you can, let's say you live near a road, no one's walking. Can you stop someone in their car? Or by telling them to stop the car, you essentially were mitzvah on them to do the malach of stopping the car. And Rabbi just touched on that on his website. Another issue would be, let's say you live on a very high floor in a building, and naturally he's going to come into the building, they're going to take the elevator. By inviting them into the building, does that mean that walking to the elevator is then a result of your tzivui? So these are all...
What about a situation that, let's say in Israel, it's very common. Let's say the prime minister lives in a certain place and lives next to you have neighbors.
Yeah.
In order for security, they put whoever passes has to go through machines.
Mm-hmm.
And the guards are Jewish, meaning they have to go. Are you allowed to go in and shops? I mean, that's the only way to go to the store. That's the only way to go to the store.
That's a different category of question. They're working in security. What certain can be over that when Israel was established, that's a big category of discussions. And once you have these security questions, what are you allowed to do for security? But that's not what we're focusing on here. And then throughout the chapter, he goes through very common situations: turning the lights on, turning the lights off, a light bulb in the refrigerator, turning on the heat, turning on the air conditioning, turning off the air conditioning, turning on the fuse, turning on a hot plate, putting food on the stove, mopping the floor, washing dishes, opening an electronic door, taking a person in a wheelchair in the street, even inviting a cleaning person to your house, and by inviting them and saying, come to my house, that means they're going to have to take a car. That means that you told them take a car on Shabbos. So it goes through all of these inyanim. I recommend going through these inyanim. But to sum up, before we go on to the last point about the controversy, that means that, as far as I could tell, he mentions nothing about the idea of giving him something that he should be nana at all. Of course, there is that category. Sometimes with the guys doing the taka for his own hana b'chlal, we're not focusing on that. It just seems like it's based on these two principles. The amira is not here because there's no amira, and the hana is not a problem because it's in those cases where the hana is mutter. Those specific cases where the hana is mutter anyway, even if it was done taka nishricht, it wasn't supposed to be done. There are others who use this idea that if he's expecting to get a tevas hana, so that could be better than him just doing something on his own. And then that leads to the question of, does that really apply to someone you're pulling off the street? Is he really doing it for a tevas hana, or is he just doing it because he's polite? Give him something, you offer them, they don't want. But it seems like according to this whole mahalach, it doesn't seem like that even factors in. That represents that. Now, everything's good and fine, but now we get to the big controversy. There's one Chabad figure who shreit chai v'kayim that it's not okay. Who's that? That is Harav Bet 11 in Kovetz Haaretz, number 826 from Tolda Samach Beis, Shiur ha'ara nochri ha'isem malacha b'Shabbos liYisrael b'teves hana. I think it's also printed in his Dovid Shalom. And he starts off by saying, quoting from Siman Reish Mem Zayin, that sending an igeres with a guy, you have to pay him. Then he's not doing it b'shvil Yisrael, he's doing it b'shvil atzmai. Then what about if he does it b'chinam? If he does it b'chinam, then it's still mistama to be mishalom gmul to the yid, so it's still ka'isa b'shvil schar. Different opinions. So he says, from all these halachas we see that when you call a non-Jew and you say, "Eini yochel, I can't do this and this, can't open the fridge until the light is turned off," and then you give him something to eat. It's also l'kol hadeis. And he says the only case where it'd be mutter in Shulchan Aruch is where he taka went on his own, mamash on his own, but here he didn't go on his own. And he continues in this very ayin Siman Shin Zayin. It says this vart of Nochi Shevi Yigaris Chasuma. It ends off. The Alter Rebbe ends off. Das atzma hu oiser lahashlim pulasei b'shlichus yigaris zu v'luchachin tzarich nimchus biyadei. So he says that's talking specifically about a Kabbalan, because it's his mission to bring the letter. So then you say, so on his own, he feels like, he wants to finish his job. Part of his job included bringing the letter. So part of it to him feels like he has to open it also. So that's unique. That's a very unique din. So I am Madur Basra B'chlal. We know Madur Basra Alter Rebbe is more makel. If a non-Jew does something on his own, then it's less of a problem. But he says, Berlo writes, so what essentially seems to be, I'm skipping a lot, but it seems that the Berlo Pashat is not acknowledging this whole concept, this whole Havana, that Remes B'derech Sipur exists. He has another way for teaching all the halachas. Here's a Kabbalan, here's this. So to him, this concept doesn't exist. You told the guy, the Remes, you told him something. So a few years later, Vayikra Samachei, Gillian 896, Mendel Yeshavitz was in the Kolel Tzemach Tzedek Yishalayim at the time. He responds to Rabbi 11 and big arichas, but his big taina is that no, the whole idea here is that we do not consider this to be a tzivoy. He's doing it me'elav, and that's the pshat in Siman Shin Zayin, and that's how you're supposed to understand all these halachas. And then you have the Alter Rebbe Madur Basra that says that if ein gufa Yisrael nana, and he does it on his own, you don't have to be meicha. So it all comes together nicely. So you have these two avanas, and then we don't have much more time anyway. A few years ago in Ayin Tes, Dayan Raskin printed Kolel Heter Amir L'Nachri B'Shabbos in number 1153 by Yeda, and he wrote over there, among other things, Klal Ches. If it's Sipur B'li Pekuda, he does it on his own. According to the Alter Rebbe, according to the Shulchan Aruch, would be only if he thinks he's doing it for himself. But according to Madur Basra, it could be even if he's doing it for the Yid, as long as the Gufa Yisrael is not nena directly from the Maisa Hanochri. He says there's actually a Maisa in the Kutei Diburim, which has been discussed. I don't know if you've heard of it. And there's a Maisa in the Kutei Diburim that there was snow on the sukkah, and the Alter Rebbe said that we should tell the guy that we can't eat in the sukkah unless with all the snow. And so it's mashma from there that something like this works. Ber 11 responded a few issues later, 1160, tremendous arichas, and again, he just seems to be repeating this idea that there is no such thing in his view of Remes B'derech Sipur. He just understands all the halachas differently, and then weiter in the next Kovetz, Raskin responded, or Tiyar from Australia responded. They don't agree with him. So it doesn't seem like Ber 11 has any cluttered eye from the Alter Rebbe that this doesn't exist. He just has a whole different mahalach and explaining the Alter Rebbe according to which this doesn't exist. So that's in short, that is our presentation on these halachas, the way the Velt understands it, and a bit of a taste, a bit of introduction to this debate in the Kovetz Haaretz. And of course, this is just the beginning for a lot more iyun in this sugya. Good Shabbos.